Our guest speaker this evening is Robert Zoellick. He has been a major figure in American foreign policy and economic policy since the 1980s, and he remains so as the author of what's the starting point for our conversation tonight, his very fine book, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. He's a former Deputy Secretary of State, the former U.S. Trade Representative, and from mid-2007 to mid-2012 served as President of the World Bank. He worked closely with Secretary of State James Baker, that understates the case, during the administration of President George H.W. Bush. As Deputy Secretary of State under the administration of George W. Bush, he played a key role in relations with China and in the very difficult negotiations over Darfur. But they were negotiations that produced an agreement that held until relatively recently. Let me note that he graduated from Swarthmore College, received a law degree from Harvard Law School, and a Master of Public Policy degree from Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Robert Zoellick, finally, welcome. We've agreed to make this a conversation with plenty of time for questions from the audience. Your book looks at American diplomacy starting from very early on, even before there was a Constitution, up to the near present. Why did you write the book?
Well, first, Robert, thanks for joining me today, and I hope Roy is able to watch on the video conference. Roy covered the State Department when I was there the first time, so that's how we got to know each other. And I also want to thank all of you for your interest in foreign policy, international affairs, critical for the United States, but always a challenge given all the other sort of demands. Which brings us to the book. So when I was working in these various jobs, I often drew upon history as I was framing foreign policy. And so I wanted to share this approach with others, including a younger generation. Now, some of you will know that Henry Kissinger wrote Diplomacy in the mid-90s, where he drew upon history to talk about foreign policy. But not surprisingly, given Henry Kissinger's perspective, it relied heavily on the European perspective and realpolitik. And so part of my motivation, Robert, was to try to draw out some of the other ideas that have infused American foreign policy over 200 years. And as you properly mentioned, in these various jobs, probably like many of you, I had often younger assistants, and because I like history, I would often ask them questions, because I had no idea how much they had learned. So I suppose maybe I tortured them a bit, but what I learned was that insofar as they'd learned history, it tended to be after World War II. And so the first 150 years was a vacuum. And one of the things I wanted to do in the book that Robert and I were talking about was there's a fascinating set of characters from the past and events, and I wanted to sort of bring them back to life in a practical way. And that also brings to another aspect, which is I taught a course based on this book at the Kennedy School last fall, and many books in foreign policy, or many courses in foreign policy now focuses on international relations theory, which many of you are familiar with. But part of my observation was that while those theories are fun to debate and they're intellectually challenging, they're of limited use when it comes time to the practical work of dealing with German unification or Darfur or sort of many of the other issues if you think about Gaza and Israel today. And so what I try to do in the book is I use stories. I use stories in a way, it's a multiple biography about how people tried to deal with the problems of their era in a practical way. So I start with Ben Franklin, run all the way up to the Bush 41 administration, then I have an afterword for some of the other people. So part of the the theme of the book is the strain of pragmatism in American foreign policy, which is kind of the practical problem-solving nature. And that reflected both my own experience, but if you think about a lot of the challenges today, if you're Secretary Blinken and you're confronting some of the issues with Gaza or with Russia and Ukraine or others, to be honest, you're not going to be doing theory. You're trying to figure out how to deal with the practicalities of these problems. So that's what I try to do in the book.
So let me, as you mentioned, you cover a tremendous amount of ground, tremendous amount of chronology. Alexander Hamilton emerges as a much more interesting figure than I realized he was going to be. You have the little known, at least to me, William Clayton, one of the architects for the Marshall Plan, Charles Evans Hughes, William Seward, Jim Baker. Who, for you, would be the one or two nearly unambiguous heroes?
Well, again, the story building on this notion of pragmatism is, and this is one of the issues that I discussed with the students, was that, reaching imperfect results in a far from perfect world is often a good day's work. The world is an ongoing challenge in these topics. And one other general reference point on this is former Secretary of Defense Mattis. I watched on an event when he was talking about when he was in office about how the world had changed in his career in that the U.S. no longer had total domain dominance. And I was thinking, in much of U.S. history, we didn't have total domain dominance. And so you had to live by your wits. I mean, and indeed, the first 150 years, that's often the story. So just to take a few examples, I open with Ben Franklin and the negotiations for American independence. But the story is, how do you move from war to peace? Well, how many times have we dealt with that? That's a rather sort of practical concept. And if you look at Franklin, who's quite a master at this, what does he have to deal with? He's got this ally France that he's a little worried that the French interest may be a little different. He's got Congress on his back. He's got a delegation where they're half acrimonious half the time. I mean, he gets along quite well with John Jay, but he says at one point with John Adams, he said, always an honest man, always well-intentioned, but sometimes in some circumstances almost out of his mind. He basically invents public diplomacy. Nobody knew the United States, but everybody knew Franklin. I mean, you can see this with his kind of everything from snuff boxes to sort of art drawings. And so there's a certain masterful skill, but the closing part, what I love is that Henry Laurens, who is one of the other peace commissioners, says at the end, he says, Dr. Franklin, your country will certainly owe you a great debt of gratitude for what you've accomplished. And he said, in my experience in peace negotiations is that somebody's always unhappy, so blessed are the peacemakers, maybe for the next life, not this one, okay? There's a lot of resonance in this, okay? But so take another one that, all of you, of course, know about Lincoln, and some of you may know about Seward. But when you think about the Civil War, how many times do you discuss the foreign policy of the Civil War, right? It's battles, it's generals, it may be social effects. But it was a very close-run thing that Britain in particular could have intervened in the Civil War and changed the whole fundamental aspects of history. So Lincoln has this wonderful, in the normal Lincoln way of kind of, one war at a time. Right, and so he and Seward are quite shrewd in using a combination of threat to keep the British and French away, but also some sense of restraint, which is also, that's an important sort of part of foreign policy. Teddy Roosevelt. Most of you will know Teddy Roosevelt, San Juan Hill, the Great White Fleet. He's an extraordinarily skillful mediator of the Russian-Japanese War of 1905. And put this in the context. Roosevelt, who was a strategic thinker, wants to restore a balance of power in East Asia. He knows the United States in 1905 is not willing to commit troops to it. And so how does he conduct this mediation exercise? And to give you one other reference point, I touch on this in my book, but my friend Phil Zellico wrote a whole book on this. There's a possibility late in 1916 that Woodrow Wilson might have mediated a peace is discussion among historians. If you compare Wilson's inability to know how to do this with Teddy Roosevelt, it's quite striking. And so part of the skill here is the nature of this. To take another example that some of you may have had dusty recollection of, Charles Evans Hughes, who is a presidential candidate in 1916, almost becomes president, loses by like 4,000 votes in California. Supreme Court Justice, he's Secretary of State in 1921. And recall, the United States has just rejected the League of Nations, rejected the Versailles Treaty. We don't even have a peace treaty with Germany, right? And so how do we sort of do this? And he quite shrewdly takes the United States and engages it internationally through the Pacific, through naval arms control. And what he recognizes is there's a movement against building battleship fleets. So he's got congressional pressure. He's got leftover issues. And so he combines arms control with regional security in the region. And I talk in the book about how he kind of moves this forward. Now, these are the uncertainties of history. If you didn't have a Great Depression, the real question was whether Japan would have had a commercial engagement strategy as it had after World War II, as opposed to trying to develop the East Asia co-prosperity sphere. You mentioned Will Clayton. This is relevant even for today. The people, Truman, Marshall, Atchison, Will Clayton, that kind of create the post-war alliance system. This is not a foregone conclusion. All of us kind of grew up with this as kind of sort of the bedrock. There was a poll done in late 45 about the importance of foreign policy, and American people ranked it at 7%. Okay, the next year it's all the way up to 14. Okay, there are a lot of things going on in America. These people really not only created the alliance system, but as we mentioned, the GATT for trade, the Marshall Plan. It's relevant because, in today, as people think about, well, can the United States do things abroad? It really does depend an awful lot on the nature of the people and kind of their view of strategy and linking it to domestic politics. And the last one I'll mention, just because, as you touched on, I worked closely with James Baker for 8 years at Treasury, State, the White House, and President Bush 41. And, when you look back at that period, you not only had peaceful end of the Cold War in Europe, German unification, the Gulf War coalition, but as you and I were discussing, many people are unaware, the only climate change treaty that the United States ever ratified was done in 92. And it's the treaty that's the basis of all these COPs that you see sort of going on. And I could explain more about that. NAFTA, which was important for trade, the Uruguay round for trade. And so part of the story I try to tell in the book is to move beyond sort of grand strategies and grand theories and how do people get stuff done, okay? Now, some of it doesn't last. That's the way life goes. But nevertheless, I think that might give you an insight on at least my experience of how the world works.
So a figure we haven't yet mentioned is Henry Kissinger, who passed away last week. Was he the indispensable man? Was he the worst of the establishment? He was the best. What should we think of him? Whether as a practitioner of the craft of diplomacy?
Well, certainly a larger than life figure, and at a personal level, he had a genuine interest in these topics. I mean, he was Secretary of State when I was in college, but yet in later years, I and others would engage with him, and he was quite serious about trying to get sort of range of views. I think I have a chapter on Nixon and Kissinger, and the title of it is American Realpolitik. So I'm trying to explain this strain of American thinking dealing with sort of the notion of power and balance of power, and I focus on the opening to China and the sort of diplomacy. But I think to understand what Nixon and Kissinger are about, you have to realize that every day in office, they were haunted by defeat in Vietnam. And Haldeman's diaries are actually quite explicit on this, about how it affected everything. And so they came into office not only facing a defeat, but the prospect of retreat. And for those of you, we've got people here with military as well as diplomatic backgrounds. Retreats are the most dangerous maneuvers. They can really slip out of control for you. And so Nixon and Kissinger had this view. They were worried about America's withdrawal from the world. They were worried about its effect on alliances. They were worried about its effect with the Soviet Union. And so, to their credit, if you think about it, within sort of 5 years afterwards, you've got the opening to China, which creates the notion of triangular diplomacy, which is the notion that the U.S. wanted to be closer to both of the other parties than they were to one another, is kind of a strategy. Second, after the Yom Kippur War, you have a masterful performance. Martin Indyk wrote a book about this, about sort of reopening the possibilities for peace with the leader of the Arab world, Egypt, and creating a different dynamic, basically pushing the Soviet Union out of the Middle East until recent years with Putin. And then third, with the Soviet Union, it's the goal of some stability, which again, in light of subsequent events, may seem not ambitious enough to Ronald Reagan. But at the time, the worry was, not only would you risk sort of Soviet aggression, but frankly, the risk of nuclear war. And people always need to keep in mind that as a possibility. Those are some pretty big achievements in terms of strategy and tactics. Now, what's on the minus side? And I talk about this in the book, and I used to talk about it with Dr. Kissinger. Henry would always joke and say, look, I don't really understand economics. And he didn't. And so one of the problems was he felt the United States was basically in a state of decline after sort of the 20 years after sort of World War II. And so in his mind, the Spenglerian concept of whether he was sort of managing America's decline with his skill. Well, it turns out that economic resilience of America and the technology and advances actually turned out the opposite way in the 80s compared to the Soviet Union. And that's sort of one of Ronald Reagan's sort of insights. The other part, and this again goes back to the genesis of the book, I don't think that realpolitik alone is sustainable in American politics. So there's other sense of whether it's economics and technology, whether it's a larger sense of purpose. You and I were talking about human rights, whether it's standing for sort of other issues. I think you have to integrate that in the nature of diplomacy. And if there's anything in the book that I kept coming back to, and frankly I feel today as well, you can't have a successful foreign policy unless it's grounded in domestic political support. All these skilled, whether it's John Quincy Adams, whether it's Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase, it's Truman, you have to build the public support. Nixon and Kissinger tried to do that with dramatic events. And this really was more Nixon than Kissinger. He always thought that you could excite the American people. By the way, this is true on the economic side, too, with the August 71 sort of removal from the gold and the sort of the dollar connection. But ultimately, I don't think it was sustainable as a policy. So that's the negative side, or sort of the limitations for his style. The one other thing, though, about Kissinger that I think it's useful to keep in mind, at least I reflect on it these days. Neil Ferguson has written the first volume of a biography, and he's supposed to get the second done on Kissinger. And the first book is titled The Idealist, which, as you know, is a little provocative because Kissinger is supposed to be the realist. But what Neil is after is, given Kissinger's background coming from Germany in the 30s, to him, the highest purpose of the diplomacy was avoiding a conflagration, avoiding a breakdown, avoiding nuclear war. And so for him, the idea of some stability in an international system, the equilibrium, the balance, and so on and so forth, was not ideal. It doesn't necessarily achieve all of America's goals, but remember the downside, okay? And this is where history loves tragedy. He inherits the downside in Vietnam. What got us into Vietnam? What was our sense of purpose in that? The reason why this is relevant today is, if you spend any time down in Washington, if you want, the one thing people agree on is confrontation with China. Well, it's probably worth thinking a little bit. Okay, where does that take you? Okay, and I understand all the bad sides of the Chinese government. I've worked with Xi Jinping, but, where are we going on some of this? And what happens if you push yourself to a miscalculation and a conflict with China? Where does that leave the world? That is part of Kissinger's sort of legacy as well. And there's a final part, which is just, for anybody interested in foreign affairs, his unbelievable skill after leaving office for 50 years to sort of stay at the heart of all these activities. He's a master at sort of understanding the American and international sort of power and imagery.
So let me follow up on China. Let's both get the benefit of hindsight, but also try to predict the future a little bit. How could American diplomats, how should have American diplomats used history in their dealings with China in the past? You can make this however recent or as you prefer. And how should history inform ongoing engagement with Xi Jinping?
So one of the ideas about applying history is it's often important to understand how other people look at their history. Okay, and by the way, this is relevant to Putin and Ukraine too. But in the case of Xi Jinping, one has to appreciate he's working in a framework of the century of humiliation. So starting in the 1839, 1840s, the Opium War, sort of the Western colonial intrusion into China. And for him, the Communist Party's legitimacy from 1949 on is in part restoring China's integrity and power. So this is Hong Kong, this is Macau, this is Tibet, this is Xinjiang, and by the way, this is Taiwan. And as well as sort of the economic dimensions. And for those of you that will enjoy a good anecdote, I got to meet Xi Jinping first in 2006 when I was Deputy Secretary of State. So he was at that time the party secretary in Zhejiang province. This was, part of his going out sort of exposure. He visited me at the State Department. I then was out of government for about a year. I visited him in Hangzhou. We had a long lunch. I stayed at his party compound. And then later when I was at the World Bank, I got to know him a little bit when he was vice president. And so I had some feel for the man. And as I was leaving the World Bank in 2012, we had produced with the Chinese a report called China 2030. So it's supposed to be the next stage of economic reforms to avoid the middle income trap. And so I have a chance to meet Xi. And, it's a very long report. You get to ask a few questions. But I said to him, what are your plans for economic development and reform? And his answer was very straightforward. He said the 86.68 million members of the Communist Party. And I remember because the numbers are transverse, so now it'd be like 95 million. And I had talked with lots of heads of government and asked them about their economic reform plans. Not one would have given me the party membership, which is kind of a clue as to where he's going and sort of his priority. And by the way, there's another little wonderful anecdote. He created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union and ordered all the party cadres to see it. Now, if that film had been produced in Europe, Gorbachev would have been the hero that helped end the Cold War. A little different in the Chinese version. Gorbachev is the fool that abandoned the Communist Party and led to rack and ruin, and the not so subtle message is it's not going to happen here. Now, let's take the U.S. side, because this is also intriguing. The U.S. historical relationship with China is so fascinating, and I draw this out a little bit in the book. It's obviously we have some historical relationships with Europe, but it's quite unique in that it's got sort of three themes. One starts before even the Constitution. Robert Morris is the financier of the Revolution, sends a ship called Empress of China with ginseng from Appalachia to China. And it has like a 400% return, okay? So this is the theme of China as the great economic bounty. It's just always gleaming right over the horizon. I have a book in my basement from the 1930s. It's titled 400 Million Customers. And it's the notion of kind of the possibility of China. That's one theme. The second theme, drawing on Kissinger, but also, as you know, I talk about John Hay and some of the other aspects, the open door, was the idea of China as a potential power. During much of this time, it's a weakness. So part of what John Hay's open door doctrine is about is also preventing the carve-up of China. Elihu Root, at that time the Secretary of War, said, the breakup of China would be as bad as the breakup of the Roman Empire. So there's this notion of China's weakness, but being a potential power. FDR obviously, believes China is going to be one of the four regional powers. Nixon and Kissinger's with the triangular diplomacy, something that I was trying to do later called China as a responsible stakeholder. So that's a second one. But the third theme is often overlooked in our secular society, and this is the missionary impulse. And, for most of the 20th century, America's view on China came from the missionaries. They were, and their children became the ambassadors. They would, bring back their stories to the Sunday school, the influence of Yale and Oberlin and all these different programs. And the missionary impulse of China isn't just religion. It's kind of bringing modernization. It's bringing education. It's bringing sort of medicines and so on and so forth. In a way, we're trying to convert the Chinese, okay? And so what happens, you could see this in our history with China, which is we keep trying to convert the Chinese to become nice Americans, okay? And when the Chinese decide they want to be Chinese, you get this revulsion, whether it's the Boxer Rebellion, whether it's 1949, whether it's 1989. And it's like a pendulum swings back. And you can think about this, when you're offering to another country what you think is the greatest opportunity, be like us, they decide they want to be like them, well, then all of a sudden you feel sort of a rejection in the process. So I think what I would draw from this, China's the power, China commercial, China's in terms of the missionary impulse. All three have elements of reality, but it's probably wisest to take China as it is, as opposed to China what we wish it would be, is kind of the bottom line of the process. And frankly, I think this continues today in terms of the debate you see on China. And if I would draw back sort of the Kissinger sort of influence on this, is that, it's kind of hard to think how you're going to deal with problems of nuclear security, AI, pandemics, climate change, trade without China in some way. It doesn't mean they're going to see the same world the way that we always see it, but we're going to have to figure out some reconciliation here. And again, on the nature of historical analogies, lots of people like to use the Cold War analogy. Okay, perhaps it's the only one they know, so they keep trying to use the Cold War. I think it's a mistaken. It will lead you in a dangerous path because, frankly, in the Cold War, as you know, you covered this, the U.S. and the Soviet Union really had quite separate systems. They intersected on nuclear war and some other security issues. China and the United States were integrated in the same system. I mean, and so there are differences of views, but it's not, there'll be a competition within the system. And China obviously wants to strengthen its hand within the system, but it's not to create a totally different system. And so we have to accommodate that in foreign policy.
We could take about 15 different countries I'd be interested in to hear your thoughts about, but let me just take two more for the moment. Difficult cases in each case, I believe. One is Iran. The other would be the Taliban-led Afghanistan. There's one country, maybe it doesn't matter too much, where there are diplomatic relations. There aren't any with Afghanistan. The other case, the Islamic Republic, it does matter that there are not diplomatic relations. How could history be used to start, restart, or wipe the slate clean? What's available to a talented American diplomacy?
So you were a foreign correspondent, and you know the benefits of actually being on location. I've been to lots of countries. I've never been to Iran. So I want to you have to discount what I say on this. The historical analogy that I would draw, and this may surprise you a little bit, goes back to Charles Evans Hughes. And remember what I said about Charles Evans Hughes. Much of the sort of remembrance of the Washington Naval Conference is of naval arms control. And maybe we've got some former Navy officers here that may recall to them, well, we didn't develop what we needed to have for World War II. Although, interestingly, because they regulated battleships, we developed submarines and aircraft carriers. But the important thing about Charles Evans Hughes was that diplomacy was trying to integrate arms control with a regional security agenda. And so when I think about the nuclear negotiations with Iran, I think one of the dangers is you can't just look at the nuclear weaponry without understanding the overall regional security. And so, frankly, while I realize these are judgment calls, I was somewhat skeptical of the Obama nuclear deal with Iran, because I think they were inattentive to Iran's sort of regional influence and what you can see with the various militias from Hezbollah to Hamas to others in the region. And so I think the lesson for me for Iran is, I'm not a big believer in theocratic regimes. I don't think that this is ultimately good or sustainable for the Iranian people. But my sense is that you want to deter dangerous Iranian behavior while avoiding a cataclysmic event. So I'm, at various points, kind of more on the side of a strong defense, deterrence, but let's be careful about kind of going over the line. And I think that bringing that back to the situation today, I think the Israeli sort of rapprochement with the Saudis and some of the other Gulf states could create a more stable security environment. That's being tested now. That's not accidental why Iran would sort of favor this. If you look at Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, it's quite interesting, though. He's got to deal with his public opinion, but he's staying on his modernization strategy. He had the Davos in the desert. He's trying to sort of move Saudi Arabia in a different direction. Obviously, with the notion that some of the things that Mohammed bin Salman has done, including with, chopping up journalists, is not exactly on your high list, but you also have to recognize this is a different leader in Saudi Arabia. And whether you like it or not, he's trying to move the system in a different direction. And so we have to recognize that as part of the power politics in that part of the world. So I think for me, the notion with Iran is, how do you contain, deter, trouble, create a stability in the region without us having to do the fighting, while letting nature take its course with Iran. Sometimes problems they're not immediately solvable.
Is there a way to be talking with Iran?
I imagine through intelligence services and indirect, you can have some conversations. But I don't, as a general matter, I believe that it's useful to talk with all parties. So I'm not trying to say that by having diplomatic discussions that you're giving people something. I'd be wary as to I'd keep my expectations in check for what I would expect to come from this Iranian regime.
Let me switch topics a moment, and I also we're going to turn to questions from the from all of you in here, the World Trade Center, in a moment or two, and also any of the questions that may have come in from Zoom. And if people here do have questions, please do, if you don't mind, if you would not mind standing up by the microphone so we can call on you soon. You were president of the World Bank during, I think even by World Bank standards, a very difficult period. It included the 2008-2009 financial crisis. What should international institutions, the two I'm thinking of, World Bank and the IMF, what can they do better? What should they do better? You mentioned human rights, you mentioned climate change. There's the indebtedness of the developing world, not a new crisis. What's available to them with the benefit of history?
So it's a great question because these institutions are very poorly understood in their role in diplomacy and international affairs. So let's start, though, with the recognition that the nation state remains the primary actor. And sometimes people act as if these institutions can do things separate from the nation states that own and sort of direct them. That's not realistic. In addition, however, and this is one of my other themes in the book, reflecting perhaps my economic background, is it's not all state actors. So it's the transnational, it's the economics, it's the trade, it's the private sector, it's the technology developments. When these institutions work best, they can serve as a sort of a thin fabric that helps connect nation states in different ways. Sometimes it's a basis for negotiation. Sometimes they can build some cooperation on various issues. They do have financial resources. They can share knowledge. So, and again, given my sort of theme of practical work, take the global financial crisis, as you mentioned. There was actually a food price crisis at this time as well. And one of the things I did at the World Bank was to sort of work with some of the UN agencies to try to get support for the humanitarian food suppliers, as well as sort of the seeds for production. And I remember actually, I used to have a morning staff meeting every morning with my senior reports, and as the food prices were going up, I remember raising this issue, and one of the chief economists said, well, when you look at the countries that are affected by high food prices, they're often benefited by other commodity prices, and so it all works out. And I said, well, have you ever considered to, disaggregate the different communities and who's going to be hit by this? And one of the other people said, well, Bob, we're a development agency, we're not a humanitarian agency. And I said, well, if you don't get through the short term, you don't get to the long term. Okay, so we created something actually that was quite new in a special trust fund to support this. And when I was leaving the World Bank, the Rwandan agriculture minister said something to me. It was very nice. She said, in the first years, you kept us going in terms of getting seeds and food supplies. We had a project to help with the infrastructure terracing in Rwanda to increase productivity. And then the last years, we had IFC, the private sector arm, help with the private sector investment for storage because they were producing so much food. This is the reality on the ground. Another example was when the financial crisis hit, the banking regulators, of course, were trying to close the barn door after the horse had left, and so they were trying to increase capital requirements for everybody, including a lot of the trade finance. Okay. So the developing countries are going to get clobbered in this. And fortunately, Pascal Lamy, my friend, been my counterpart at the European Commission, and I at the World Bank, knew the banking supervisors and sort of said, look, can we have some discussion here about what capital requirements you're going to pose on trade finance? This is the practical work. So today you've got issues related to climate, so that you got discussed at the COP in the Gulf. But again, remember, for a lot of developing countries, they still look at climate a little bit as a developed country issue. They want to develop, and so they were concerned about resilience and adaptation. So are there ways to blend these two together? Yes, but so the challenge for these institutions is how do they perform a catalytic role? Okay. So whether it's reconstruction on Ukraine, at some point it'll be dealing with Gaza. Frankly, with China, you've got the debt issue in some of the developing countries. How can they provide a neutral forum for some of those discussions? So it's actually they're quite interesting in terms of multilateral diplomacy. And the leaders of those institutions, if they've got a slightly broader view, can sort of help link people together that otherwise might miss an opportunity.
What role let me back up, what importance should the United States give to human rights in dealing with its friends, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, appalling human rights records, and with states that are not its friends? It's something we had briefly talked about before our session began with Jimmy Carter's administration, in a way adding human rights to the issues, to sort of a permanent set of issues, in the way that now climate change, thanks in part to your work, is now a permanent part of key issues. Where does human rights fit in? Where should it fit in dealing with friends and not friends?
So Robert and I were talking about, in the book, I tell these stories over 20 years, but I do try to pull it together with 5 traditions. And the last tradition is America's purpose. And I'm conscious, I avoid using the word exceptionalism because I didn't want to make it just an American issue, but I think there's a story about a larger purpose here. So for those of you that still carry cash, someday take out your wallet and look at the back of a dollar bill. I don't know if you've ever looked closely, okay, but that's the Grand Seal of the United States. And on the obverse, have you noticed this unfinished pyramid with the Eye of Providence above it? Okay, so what's all that about? Is it Masonic symbols or something? But so this was, it took almost as long to win the revolution as it was to come up with this sort of this symbol of the United States. And underneath it, it's got Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. And by the way, notice the pyramid's unfinished. Okay, work isn't done. Eye of Providence looking over it. Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. And Charles Thompson, who's the secretary to the convention, explains the origins of this and about the idea that the United States clearly, even as it's just starting a republic, has some larger purpose in the world. And my first diplomatic history professor, and he refers to a new American era. And I always remembered my first diplomatic history professor said, was America used as an adjective to be geographically constraining or broadly descriptive? And that's been the debate sort of for America for 200 years. And so my own view of the purpose is it's always part of the policy. It's kind of where perhaps Henry Kissinger didn't have this part of appreciation of American history. But it's a combination of what's the context internationally. So at the time of the founding of the United States, it was simply to show the republic would work. This is a new thing, right? And for Lincoln, it was as the last best hope of mankind. How do you keep this thing from pulling apart in a civil war? Woodrow Wilson, you remember, had make the world safe for democracy. He doesn't say make the world into democracy. He's trying to deal with the preservation of a context for democratic thought. It's the 4 freedoms in World War II. It's the leader of the free world. This is always a theme that runs through the process, but then it also depends, frankly, on the political context at home. What are the American people willing to support? And kind of what's our power and ability to get things done? Human rights is part of this. And I also have a chapter on Elihu Root where it's kind of you and I talked about the international law tradition, and human rights falls out of the international law tradition. So I don't think one can have a formula. I think you properly made the point. I think Jimmy Carter helped raise the profile of this as an issue. And one has to, and making how you integrate it in your diplomacy brings us right back to this challenge about the practical work. At what point, do you sacrifice ties for a larger aim? And this connects back with Kissinger. So you used Egypt. This has been an ongoing tension for the United States. So where would the United States be without some relationship with Egypt today, with Gaza, and dealing with Israel? Okay. On the other hand, it's not a very attractive regime, and frankly, it's got ongoing economic sort of problems that I tried to work at unsuccessfully at various points. But so this brings us back to the challenge of, imperfect solutions in a far from perfect world.
Again, if any of you have questions you'd like to ask, please do line up. Let me ask you this. Tell us two successes, two what you believe are two meaningful successes of the current American administration, and one disappointment of the current administration, if you don't mind.
So on the success, following President Trump was not an easy situation here. It was a very transactional policy that undermined alliances. And I think the most basic success, and this shows up in different ways, is trying to restore the alliance relationships. So with U.S., Japan, Korea, the creation of AUKUS with Australia, with the sort of the long-term technology relationships, restoring some confidence in NATO. This is very important because, again, to link it to the history, for 150 years, America avoids alliances. We don't want to have alliances. But so then we create this alliance system, but the system has to sort of continue to adapt. I suppose a second one, but we'll see, is I think with Ukraine, the administration has tried to avoid an escalation to total conflict with Russia while being supportive of Ukrainian sovereignty and ability to defend itself. I think they were quite skillful with their European colleagues at drawing this together. I personally feel they were a little bit short on some of the military supplies at front. And now, and this is an issue everybody can watch in the news over the next couple of months, I had always suspected this would become a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, economics is just as important as military support. And so Larry Summers and I and Phil Zellico have been writing a piece saying, what about transferring the $300 billion of Russian reserves to an escrow to help Ukraine? And you can see Congress is struggling to get even military support, and they're not going to give economic support. The Europeans are struggling now with some of the German debt break. So frankly, I've been a little frustrated. This is a mixed case. I kind of wish I could have gotten some help from the administration on this. We brought together international lawyers. We got Larry Triber in a memo, others. We tried to deal with the concerns that people had about the dollar and the euro. Larry Summers and I jokingly said, in our experience, it's rare that you find an issue that's good policy, good politics, and ethically sound. So when you get one of those, I'm surprised people haven't jumped on it. But I think you're going to see this move forward just because of the reality. You're going to get, otherwise Ukraine won't survive, and Putin will win the sort of the war of wills. On the negative side, and we talked a little bit, we haven't talked much about trade tonight. I think the United States, it's a very dangerous step that basically the Biden administration is perpetuating Trump's protectionism. This morning, I was dealing with the U.S. ASEAN group, okay? And anybody that deals with East Asia knows that economics is the coin of the realm. And where's the United States on the notion of any sort of trade negotiations? And to give you, again, a very practical step, some of you may have seen a report of this, but it's probably slipped past, is that right before this APEC meeting in San Francisco with many of the countries of the Asia Pacific, the United States reversed its policy in the World Trade Organization on an e-commerce agreement, and frankly also in the IPEF negotiation, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, to pull back from discussions on digital and data. Well, if I were a U.S. trade representative today, I'd be spending 90% of my time on digital and data. It drives everything, every part of the economy. So why in God's name would the United States pull out of an effort to try to set the standards and the baseline for the future of a more open system? So this is going to be a very big question, because I'll tell you privately, I talked with some people in the administration, not at the very top level, because the top level is all busy trying to get reelected, as you know, but the level below, and I said, look, if President Biden's reelected, and it's 2025, somebody ought to be thinking about where you're going to put your chips, because you'll have about a year and a half tops before a midterm election. Biden isn't getting any younger. And maybe, you ought to recalibrate some of the aspects of trade policy and going forward. Because going back to this theme about how America influences the world, and by the way, whether it's development and openness, our trump card is our openness. Our openness to people, to ideas, to capital, to goods. That's the idea that we should be imitating China drives me nuts. I mean, so do you think this is going to work out so well for China? Go watch what's happening to their economy. So this is an area where I would put is on the negative side.
If I had my way, we would spend the second hour of our discussion, and maybe the third, on these issues on trade and economics. The first gentleman here, please, your question.
My name is Jack Tucker, and
where are you from, Jack?
I'm from Baltimore, Maryland, and I've been a student of history, European history primarily, over a long period, but other areas too. And as I think back over the course of my lifetime, but especially 25 years ago, everybody was talking about Japan. And there were all these books about that Japan was the model. And then all of a sudden, now 25 years later, one really doesn't talk about Japan. And cars are now made in Korea, and chips are now made in Taiwan. And a lot of this has to do with the transfer of technology from the United States. The transistor was developed in the United States, and then all of a sudden it was developed in Japan. And then I say, well, this is happening over and over again. And now somehow China bought up America's technology or acquired it. And now, temporarily, the move is to China. But in between Japan and China, we had a remarkable period where all of a sudden the United States developed computers and iPhones, and all of a sudden the United States revived. And as I look back, that's been true all along. That's nothing new. The United States emerged as the only power after World War II that hadn't been destroyed. And then gradually, all of a sudden, we saw German cars and French this, and all of a sudden that changed. So over and over again, we see this. And China's role may be temporary, the way Japan's was. Maybe not, I don't know. But a lot of the technology, like CRISPR, is developed in the United States, and then all of a sudden it's exploited by other countries. So what I see is that American power depends a lot on the economic development here in the United States. So many of these things developed in the United States, and the United States gave it away. So, question?
What do you think, huh? Your advocacy is so powerful that I'm going to Japan next week. So how about that? So I guess I share many of your observations. I take it in a slightly different direction, I guess. I mean, so by the way, to stick on Japan for a moment, I had breakfast yesterday with a man named Yuichi Funabashi, who used to be the editor of the Asahi Shimbun. He's writing a biography of Abe. And Abe is quite an interesting historical figure in sort of now changing Japan. And I think, if anything, what the U.S.-Japan relationship underscores is the importance of the alliance ties and partnership. So while we had trade frictions and other issues, those went away in some ways. The Japanese system didn't work quite as effectively as some people thought. And now, frankly, the Japanese-Korean reconciliation, if that can be continued, the U.S.-Japanese relationship, the Japanese role in Southeast Asia and with India, with the Quad, these are very important developments for the larger system, and including dealing with uncertainties for China. So part of my message of that goes back to, let's not let's not lose confidence in our own ability to have the economic resilience and innovation. And by the way, economics can be a little different than sometimes pure security. You can have win-win possibilities here. So if Japan benefits and we benefit and Europe benefits, fine with me. Okay. Now, a little piece on the technology side, and that is, see, I was actually at the Treasury Department in the 80s and then State Department later. I fought to try to keep U.S. markets open. Now, some people didn't like that. They wanted to protect U.S. industry. But U.S. industry, frankly, had to make some changes, okay? And the competition from China or from Japan helped sort of force those changes. I think that's good in the end. Now, you have to help people adjust to the process, and that's sort of another dimension of the story. But it's why I get worried about the protectionism today, because I don't think that'll make us stronger over time. And by the way, remember, 50% of imports are basically for consumption or inputs into other goods. So you make those more expensive, you're going to make your industries less efficient. And by the way, so a message to the Biden administration, one thing that people seem to be concerned about is price inflation. So why would I be putting more taxes on things that are sort of coming into the country? On the technology side, again, there's a need in the case of China. I understand some concern for export controls and some limits on some of the advanced technology. But we have to be a little careful with some of this, because at the end of the day, our strength, again, is having people from come all over the world be able to compete and invent here. And as someone who studied the economic history of technologies, maybe with some of these technologies, you can keep the Chinese 5 years behind, but you're never going to stop them. They're going to have their own ability to develop things. And then you have to decide what's the cost of this, okay? So to put that in another context, President Trump, put on a bunch of tariffs. The U.S. put on a bunch of tariffs. And so what did we really do here? I mean, we increased the cost for everybody. I mean, here's an interesting little story. Tesla, of course, was the most advanced company in electric vehicles. We put on tariffs, China puts on tariffs, Tesla goes and builds a plant in China, quite a successful plant. It develops a whole ecosystem for electric vehicles. Last year, China is the biggest exporter of not only electric vehicles, all vehicles. So what did we exactly accomplish here by chasing Tesla to build the operation there? So this is where the second and third order effects of protectionism, and I'll have to add sometimes industrial policies, are a little concerning. On the industrial policy, just to whet your appetite here, I'm a big believer in sort of the R&D and the basic research. There's a chapter in my book by a man named Vannevar Bush. You won't find this in most foreign policy books because he's the founder of sort of American science and technology policy. But when you start to pick favorites and subsidies and kind of then sort of whether it's the semiconductors or whether it's some of the other industries, I get a little nervous. These haven't worked out so well. And frankly, at some point, somebody's going to have to take a look at the deficit. I mean, our deficit's about 7% of GDP during relatively good growth. Our debt as a percentage of GDP is 98%. You talked about World War II, it was 106% in 1946, and our number is going up. So at some point here, we are constrained by how much we can spend, and we better spend it a little bit more wisely. So my mantra here is openness, ideas, goods, people, capital, help people adjust, whether it's the education or sort of other aspects, but don't close America off.
Let me take one more question.
In yesterday's Baltimore Sun, there was a very good short and sweet article about Henry Kissinger and his policy towards South America and how involved he was in the overthrow of governments in Chile and Argentina and other countries too. And it was terrible. I mean, looking back on it now, you could say, how could we possibly be doing this? Death squads, throwing people out of helicopters, supporting just obviously bad guys, all in the name of anti-communism. And apparently, according to the article, Henry Kissinger himself was very personally interested in pursuing those kind of policies. Are you familiar with those, and how could he be so esteemed, and at the same time be responsible for those kind of obviously not good policies?
At least as I've read the history in Chile, it's a little bit more complicated. Okay, some of these pieces sort of assume that the United States, led the coup. I think you had a very strong reaction within Chile to Allende, and I think certainly the United States was sympathetic to those in the coup, but I don't, at least as I recall the record, I don't think we were the precipitator of the coup. Now, you can argue whether that creates the environment and so on and so forth. You mentioned Argentina. I don't recall any coup that we did in Argentina. I mean, so one has to be a little careful here. The Latin America community sometimes gets worked up about this, but I'm not sure the facts support that. Now, on the other hand, to be sympathetic to your point, I do think that Kissinger's approach to the Cold War overstated some of these conflicts around the world and always saw them in the zero-sum context, okay? And I think that's true in Latin America. And it's probably true in Africa as well, okay? You're an Army officer. Part of this, you always have to go back to the times, the anxiety that people had, though, about the Soviet Union and its reach. We now have 20/20 hindsight. It not only failed, it broke up. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62 and other. It was a fearsome thing. So I offer them space on that. But the main reason that I'm drawing out the second point is that, frankly, I see this a little bit with China today. So every movement China makes, we have to respond. This is a competition with us in some form or another. Building on your point, I'd be a little more disciplined about whether I have to react to every one of these, okay? So we've got problems in Venezuela. Again, the Venezuelan regime is a dangerous, threatening regime. But China has some relationship with Venezuela. Well, am I really concerned at the end of the day about Chinese relying on Venezuelan oil? I mean, how hard would that be to cut off if you wanted to do it, okay? So sometimes there's a danger here of overreacting if you see sort of another foe on the other side. And so that's why a little bit my point with China was to say, look, frankly, I think we should be doing more in terms of our defense capacity in the Indo-Pacific, and I think we need the alliance relationship for deterrence. But every time there's some Chinese move, we don't feel we have to rush to make a counter move. As your history suggests, and with the Soviet Union, sometimes the other guy makes a dumb move, and the best thing to do is just let him fall.
Robert Zoellick, thank you very much. A great, great world tour.